Let me tell you the most American story ever told. Britain, the most powerful empire on earth, decided to tax tea, not a lot. A few pennies per pound, a tax so small that the tea was actually cheaper after the tax than it had been before, because the new law cut out the middlemen. America said, absolutely not, and then proceeded to throw an entire shipment of tea into a harbor, form an army, fight the most powerful military in the world for 8 years, lose most of the battles, nearly collapse multiple times from lack of money and supplies, and somehow, against every reasonable probability, win, and then built a country that would eventually become the most powerful nation in the history of human civilization. Over tea. Technically, not even really about the tea, but we'll get to that. Here is what most people get wrong about the American Revolution. They think it was inevitable, that a bunch of freedom-loving colonists rose up against obvious tyranny, and obviously won because obviously they were right. The reality is messier, more interesting, and considerably more insane. The Continental Army was at various points so poorly supplied that soldiers were literally fighting without shoes in winter. George Washington lost more battles than he won. The revolution was saved, multiple times, by a combination of French intervention, British incompetence, and sheer bloody-minded refusal to quit. And the people who founded this country were not a unified band of brothers. They were a collection of lawyers, farmers, merchants, and idealists who disagreed violently about almost everything except one thing. They were done being told what to do by a king 3,000 miles away. That stubbornness, that specific, particular, deeply American refusal to accept authority without representation, built a republic that rewrote the rules of human governance and is still running, more or less 250 years later. It started with tea. It ended with a constitution, and the path between those 2 points is one of the most improbable stories in human history. But before we get into the tea, the battles, the brutal winters, the French who saved everything, and the document that changed the world, welcome to Sketchy Past. Fast history, zero fluff, maximum chaos. If you are new here, subscribe right now and join the Sketchy Empire. Ring that bell. We're 10 videos in, and the momentum is real. The 4th of July is coming, and there is no better time to understand exactly how this country got built. Let's go. To understand the American Revolution, you need to understand what the relationship between Britain and the colonies actually looked like before it collapsed, because it wasn't always hostile. For most of the colonial period, it was something closer to benign neglect, and that neglect had allowed something unexpected to grow. The 13 American colonies had been established over the course of the 17th and early 18th centuries for various reasons: religious freedom, economic opportunity, the disposal of inconvenient populations, corporate profit. They were not a unified entity. They had different economies, different social structures, different religious traditions, and different relationships with the Native American peoples whose land they were occupying. A Virginia tobacco planter and a Massachusetts Puritan merchant had almost nothing in common culturally. What they had in common was distance. 3,000 miles of Atlantic Ocean separated the colonies from Britain. In the 17th and early 18th centuries, that distance meant that Britain's control over its American colonies was largely theoretical. The colonies developed their own legislatures, their own legal traditions, their own economic networks. They governed themselves, more or less, because governing them from London was practically difficult and not obviously worth the effort. This period is sometimes called salutary neglect. The policy of not bothering the colonies too much and letting them largely run their own affairs, which turned out to be extremely good for colonial economic development and extremely bad for British authority, because the colonists got used to self-government and started thinking of it as their right. Then came the French and Indian War, or, as the rest of the world knows it, the 7 Years' War, which ran from 1754 to 1763. Britain and France, the two dominant colonial powers, fought a global conflict across North America, Europe, India, and the Caribbean. Britain won comprehensively, gaining enormous new territories, including French Canada. It also ran up an enormous debt. The British government looked at this debt, looked at their American colonies, which had benefited significantly from British military protection during the war, and made a decision that seemed completely reasonable in London and felt like a declaration of war in Boston. They were going to tax the colonies to help pay for it. This was, from a British perspective, genuinely logical. The colonists had been defended. They should contribute to the cost of their defense. The taxes proposed were modest by any reasonable standard. From the American perspective, the issue was not the amount. The issue was the principle. The colonies had no representation in the British Parliament. They had not been consulted about the taxes. They had not voted for the members of Parliament who imposed the taxes, and the English political tradition, which the colonists considered their birthright as English subjects, was very clear on this point. Taxation without representation was tyranny. No taxation without representation was not a slogan the colonists invented. It was an argument rooted in English constitutional law going back to Magna Carta. The colonists were not demanding something new. They were demanding what they believed they were already owed as English subjects. Britain heard this argument and responded, "Essentially, you are colonists, not Englishmen, and Parliament represents the interests of the entire empire whether you voted for it or not." This was the conceptual core of the conflict, and there was no obvious compromise available. Either Parliament had the right to tax the colonies without their consent, or it didn't. Both sides were certain they were right, and both sides were willing to fight about it. The British Parliament's first major attempt to tax the colonies directly was the Stamp Act of 1765, a tax on all printed materials in the colonies. Legal documents, newspapers, pamphlets, even playing cards all required a special stamp showing the tax had been paid. The colonial reaction was immediate and severe. Colonial legislatures passed resolutions against it. Mobs attacked the offices of stamp distributors. A Stamp Act Congress convened in New York, the first time representatives from multiple colonies had met together, and sent a unified petition to Parliament arguing the tax was unconstitutional. Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1766. Then, having repealed it, immediately passed the Declaratory Act, asserting that Parliament had the right to legislate for the colonies, in all cases whatsoever. The message, "We're taking back the tax, but we are absolutely not conceding the principle." This pattern, Britain imposing taxes, colonists resisting, Britain backing down, repeated itself with variations for the next decade. The Townshend Acts of 1767 imposed duties on imported goods like glass, paint, paper, and tea. Colonial boycotts of British goods proved effective enough that most of the duties were eventually repealed, except the tax on tea, which was kept specifically to assert Parliament's right to tax. Then came the Boston Massacre in 1770, which was considerably less of a massacre and considerably more of a chaotic street confrontation than its name suggests, but which colonial propagandists, including Paul Revere, who produced an extremely misleading engraving of the event, used to maximum effect to inflame colonial opinion. 5 colonists were killed by British soldiers, who were being pelted with rocks and ice by an angry crowd. The soldiers were tried and mostly acquitted, defended by John Adams, who believed in the rule of law even when it was politically inconvenient. But massacre was the word that stuck. And then the Tea Act of 1773 was actually intended to help the colonists, not punish them. The British East India Company was facing bankruptcy, sitting on enormous quantities of unsold tea. Parliament passed the Tea Act to allow the company to sell directly to the colonies, cutting out colonial middlemen, which would have made tea cheaper than before, even with the tax included. Colonial merchants who were being cut out of the tea trade objected vigorously. Colonial political leaders objected to the principle of the tax. And on the night of the 16th of December, 1773, a group of colonists, some dressed somewhat unconvincingly as Mohawk Indians, which apparently seemed like a good disguise at the time, boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbor and threw 342 chests of tea into the water. The Boston Tea Party was not a spontaneous popular uprising. It was an organized political action by a group called the Sons of Liberty, led by figures including Samuel Adams. The British response, the Coercive Acts of 1774, which the colonists called the Intolerable Acts, closed Boston Harbor until the destroyed tea was paid for, restricted Massachusetts self-government, required colonists to house British soldiers, and allowed British officials accused of crimes to be tried in Britain rather than the colonies. Instead of isolating Massachusetts and breaking colonial resistance, the intolerable acts united the colonies in outrage. The First Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia in September 1774, with representatives from 12 of the 13 colonies. They agreed to a colonial boycott of British goods, and crucially, agreed to meet again if the situation wasn't resolved. The situation was not resolved. It got considerably worse. On the 19th of April 1775, British troops marched out of Boston toward Lexington and Concord to seize colonial military supplies. Paul Revere and others rode through the night to warn the colonists. At Lexington, a small group of colonial militia faced the British column. Someone fired a shot, no one knows who. 8 colonists were killed at Lexington. The British marched on to Concord, found most of the supplies had been removed, and started back toward Boston, and the entire countryside ambushed them. Colonial militia fired from behind trees, stone walls, and farm buildings all along the route back to Boston. By the time the British reached safety, they had suffered 273 casualties. The colonial militias had demonstrated something important. They could hurt the most professional army in the world. The American Revolution had begun. The Second Continental Congress convened in May 1775 and faced the immediate problem of what to do with the various colonial militias that were gathering around Boston. They needed to turn a collection of farmers, hunters, and tradesmen into something resembling an army. They needed a commander. They chose George Washington. Washington was a Virginia planter and former military officer who had fought in the French and Indian War with mixed results. He had been involved in the disastrous Braddock expedition of 1755, in which a British force was ambushed and nearly destroyed, and had survived. He was known, respected, and crucially, he was from Virginia. Choosing a Virginian to command what was primarily a Massachusetts problem was a deliberate political decision to unite the southern and northern colonies behind a common cause. Washington was not a military genius in the way that Caesar or Napoleon or Alexander were military geniuses. He did not win battles through brilliant tactical innovations that left his enemies bewildered. What he was instead was something arguably more important for the American situation. A leader who understood that his primary strategic objective was not to win battles, but to keep an army in the field. Britain was the most powerful military in the world. The Continental Army could not defeat it in conventional pitched battle. Washington learned this the hard way in the early campaigns around New York in 1776, where the British under General Howe outmaneuvered and outfought the Continental Army repeatedly, driving Washington's forces out of New York, across New Jersey, and to the brink of complete collapse. What Washington understood, and what his opponents often failed to appreciate, was that the war was not going to be won by destroying the British army. It was going to be won by surviving long enough for the British to decide the war wasn't worth fighting anymore. This required a specific kind of military thinking. Fight when you can win or when you must. Retreat when you can't win. Keep the army together. Keep the cause alive. Accept tactical defeats to preserve strategic viability. It was an extraordinarily difficult posture to maintain psychologically and politically. After the disasters around New York, Continental Army enlistments were expiring, and men were going home. The Continental Congress was in chaos. Several of his own officers thought Washington was too cautious. Colonial public opinion was wavering. Washington responded with one of the most famous military gambles in American history. On the night of the 25th of December, -26, 1776, Washington led 2,400 soldiers across the ice, choked Delaware River in a blizzard, marched through the night, and attacked a Hessian garrison at Trenton, New Jersey at dawn on the 26th of December. The Hessians, German mercenaries hired by the British, were caught completely off guard. The battle lasted less than an hour. Nearly 1,000 Hessians were captured. The Continental Army lost 0 men in the battle. Washington followed Trenton with another victory at Princeton days later. The effect on American morale was enormous proof that the Continental Army could win, that the cause was not lost, that continuing the fight was worth it. Enlistments recovered, the army survived, the war continued. The nadir came at Valley Forge in the winter of 1777–78. Washington's army camped at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, while the British comfortably occupied Philadelphia. The Continental Army entered Valley Forge with roughly 12,000 men and emerged in the spring with around 8,000. The difference mostly not from battle but from disease, starvation, and desertion. Soldiers were barefoot in snow. They were eating bark. They were dying of typhus and dysentery in log huts. They built themselves. What happened at Valley Forge was not just suffering, it was transformation. A Prussian military officer named Baron Friedrich von Steuben arrived at Valley Forge and spent the winter drilling the Continental Army in European military tactics, formations, movements, bayonet fighting. The army that emerged from Valley Forge in the spring of 1778 was, by almost every account, a substantially more capable military force than the one that entered it. Valley Forge is remembered as a story of suffering and survival. It was also the training ground that produced the army that won the war. On the 4th of July, 1776, while Washington was trying to defend New York against a British invasion force, the Continental Congress formally adopted the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson wrote most of it in a rented room in Philadelphia over about 2 weeks, complained constantly about the heat and the flies, and produced one of the most consequential documents in human history, almost as a byproduct of general irritation. The Declaration served multiple purposes simultaneously. It was a legal argument, a formal articulation of why the colonies had the right to separate from Britain, framed in the political philosophy of John Locke and the Enlightenment. It was a propaganda document, a list of specific grievances against King George III, designed to build and maintain colonial support for the war. And it was a diplomatic statement, a signal to European powers, particularly France, that this was a serious political revolution, not just a colonial rebellion. The famous opening lines are worth pausing on, because they were genuinely radical for 1776. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These words established a principle of human equality and natural rights that its authors did not fully live up to. Jefferson himself owned over 600 enslaved people over the course of his life, and the Declaration's promise of equality would take nearly another century of civil war and another century of civil rights struggle to begin approaching fulfillment. But the principle itself, that government derives its legitimacy from the consent of the governed, that human beings have rights that no government can legitimately take away, was revolutionary in ways that echoed far beyond 1776. The French Revolution drew on it. Independence movements across the 19th and 20th centuries cited it. The Declaration of Independence is one of the most influential political documents in human history, and its influence has consistently exceeded what its authors intended or practiced. Now, the French. The American Revolution almost certainly fails without France. This is not a popular thing to say in American history classes, but it is true. France and Britain were imperial rivals with a long history of warfare and mutual antagonism. The American Revolution was, from France's perspective, an opportunity to weaken Britain at relatively low cost by supporting the British colonies in rebellion. French support began covertly almost immediately. Money, weapons, and supplies flowed to the Continental Army through a front company before France officially entered the war. The turning point was Saratoga in October 1777, where an American force under General Horatio Gates defeated and captured an entire British army under General Burgoyne. This was the first major American victory of the war, and it convinced the French that the Americans could actually win. France formally allied with the United States in February 1778, entering the war against Britain openly. This changed everything. Britain now had to fight a global war, defending its Caribbean colonies, its interests in India, its home waters, not just suppress a colonial rebellion. French naval power directly challenged British control of the seas, which had been Britain's critical strategic advantage. The Marquis de Lafayette, a young French aristocrat who had joined Washington's army as a volunteer and become one of his most trusted generals, exemplified the French contribution to the American cause. But the decisive French intervention was naval. The Battle of the Chesapeake in September 1781, where a French fleet under Admiral de Grasse defeated the British Navy and cut off the British Army in Virginia from relief or escape. This set up the final act. By the fall of 1781, British strategy had shifted to the south. General Cornwallis had been campaigning through the Carolinas and Virginia, trying to suppress the revolution in the southern colonies. His army of roughly 8,000 men was encamped at Yorktown, Virginia, on a peninsula between the York and James rivers, waiting for the British fleet to bring supplies and potentially evacuate if necessary. The French fleet's victory at the Battle of the Chesapeake meant the British fleet couldn't get through. Cornwallis was trapped. Washington marched his army south from New York, a movement executed with enough secrecy that the British in New York didn't realize what was happening until it was too late. Combined American and French forces totaling roughly 17,000 men surrounded Yorktown. The siege began on the 28th of September, 1781. French and American artillery pounded the British positions. Key defensive positions, called redoubts, were stormed in coordinated night attacks. American forces under Alexander Hamilton took one. French forces took another. The British position became untenable. On the 19th of October, 1781, Cornwallis surrendered. His second, in command, General O'Hara, carried the sword of surrender to the French and American commanders. Cornwallis himself claimed illness and refused to attend the ceremony. The British army marched out between lines of French and American soldiers, the British band playing a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down." The world had, in fact, been turned upside down. Yorktown effectively ended major combat operations, though formal peace wasn't concluded until the Treaty of Paris in September 1783. Britain recognized American independence, ceded territory east of the Mississippi River, and agreed to remove British troops from American soil. The revolution had been won. Now came the harder part, building a country. The Articles of Confederation, the first American governing document, turned out to be nearly non-functional. It created a federal government so weak it couldn't tax, couldn't regulate trade, and couldn't force states to comply with its decisions. The country that had fought 8 years for independence was, by the mid-1780s, in serious danger of dissolving into 13 separate squabbling nations. Shays' Rebellion in 1786–87, an uprising of Massachusetts farmers who couldn't pay their debts, demonstrated that the federal government couldn't even suppress a domestic rebellion. It alarmed the founders into action. The Constitutional Convention convened in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787, ostensibly to revise the Articles of Confederation. Instead, it produced an entirely new document, the Constitution of the United States, which created the framework of American government that still functions today. 3 branches, separation of powers, a system of checks and balances designed explicitly to prevent any one person or faction from accumulating too much power. The men who wrote it were not naive idealists. They were practical politicians who had spent years watching what happened when governments had too much power and too little accountability. They built a system designed to be argued about, one where ambition would check ambition, where no branch could permanently dominate the others, where the rules could be changed, but only through deliberate, difficult processes. It was not perfect. It preserved slavery. It excluded women from political participation. Its promises of equality and rights were applied grotesquely unevenly from the beginning. But the framework it created, the idea that government power must be limited, accountable, and derived from the consent of the governed, was revolutionary in ways that continue to reverberate through history. Every democracy that has been established since 1787 has grappled, in some way, with the ideas that the Constitutional Convention produced in Philadelphia that summer. Let's come back to the tea. The Boston Tea Party was not really about tea. The Stamp Act resistance was not really about stamps. The American Revolution was not really about any of the specific taxes that triggered it. It was about a question that had never been answered satisfactorily by any government in human history: who has the right to govern? And where does that right come from? The traditional answer, the answer that had governed most of human civilization for thousands of years, was that the right to govern came from God, or from birth, or from conquest, or from some combination of all three. Kings ruled because God had ordained it, or because their ancestors had taken the land, or because they were strong enough to hold it. The people were governed. They did not govern themselves. The American Revolution offered a different answer. The right to govern comes from the consent of the governed. Government is not a divine institution or a natural hierarchy. It is a practical arrangement that free people make with each other to manage their collective affairs. And it is legitimate only as long as it serves its people's interests. This idea had been articulated before by Locke, by Montesquieu, by the thinkers of the Enlightenment. But the American Revolution was the first time it had been put into practice at scale, with an actual government built on these principles, with an actual constitution that tried to give them institutional form. It didn't work perfectly. It still doesn't work perfectly. The gap between the Declaration's promises and the country's reality has been the central tension of American history from 1776 to the present. But the idea survived. The Republic survived. And the example of a government actually built on consent and representation, however imperfectly, changed what people thought was possible everywhere. The French Revolution drew on it. Latin American independence movements drew on it. Anti-colonial movements across Africa and Asia in the 20th century drew on it. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights draws on it. A tax on tea. A group of colonists who decided they were done being told what to do. 8 years of a war they probably should have lost. And a document that begins with the words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident." The world has been arguing about those truths ever since, which is probably exactly what the founders intended. That was the American Revolution. The war that started over a tax so small it actually made tea cheaper, that was nearly lost multiple times. That was saved by a Prussian drill sergeant in the French Navy, and that produced a document and a system of government that changed the entire trajectory of human political history. It was messy, contradictory, improbable, and magnificent, exactly like the country it created. If this video hit you differently than you expected, if American history class never made it feel like this video right now, every like matters for a channel at this stage. It tells the algorithm we're worth pushing. Subscribe to Sketchy Past if you haven't already. Ring that bell. The 4th of July is coming, and we are just getting started on American history. Next episode, World War II. The deadliest conflict in human history. 85 million dead. A war fought on every continent except Antarctica, under the ocean, and eventually above the clouds. A war that produced the Holocaust and the liberation of Europe, the atomic bomb and the United Nations, the absolute worst and the complicated best of what humanity is capable of. And it all started in a direct line from a wrong turn in Sarajevo in 1914 and a peace treaty that was designed to punish rather than heal. The sequel is always worse than the original. See you in the next one.